Ariel has such a vivid and disturbing impact on English critics and readers alike. Ariel is personal testaments to the loneliness and insecurities that plague Plath. The living are transformed into horrifying psychological experiences of the poet. This is a this is a quote directed from a critic that was written about the poem Ariel that was written about Plath.
And this statement is very descriptive of the dark personality that kind of comes out in Plath's work.
Plath was born in October 27th in 1932 in Boston, Massachusetts. She lived there through her childhood, and then she died in February 1963 in London. So, as she was growing up, when she was about 8 years old, that's when she was first published. She published in a local newspaper a poem. And then also, when she was 8 years old, her father had died. And this is pretty significant because her father was a major source of where her writings came from. Her father his name was Odo. He was a German immigrant, and he was a professor and also an expert beekeeper. So this is where poems such as Daddy and Bees comes from. And then throughout her childhood, she was a very, very smart, intelligent young lady. She got full rides to Smith College. And in Smith College, she was doing great. And then her junior year, she got an internship at a assistant editor magazine position. And this is when she attempted her first suicide. Her first suicide, she went underneath her house, like underneath her deck, and swallowed a lot of sleeping pills in order to try to kill herself. And this, thankfully, didn't succeed. After her first suicide attempt, she was diagnosed as clinically sick and had to go to extensive hospitals in order to get better. She even had to go through psychotherapy and electric shock therapy, which she later writes about for inspiration in the book, The Bell Jar, and this is an autobiographical novel that she had written. After this, she graduated from Smith University and went on to get full marks at Cambridge University. And this is when she met her husband, an English poet named Ted Hughes. Ted was a well-known writer in England at the time as well. This is when she wrote her first book, The Colossus, and this was written in 1960, and she was 28 years old at the time. Sylvia and Ted settled in a small village called Devon. However, just after 2 years after their first child, the marriage had fallen apart and they got a divorce. She suffered from depression and a lot of internal issues at this time, and this is where a majority of her more darker kind of writing took place in her life. Then shortly after this, at the age of 30, on February 11th, 1963, she decided to take her own life through the gas stove. What she did was she duct taped the doors of her child into her room so the gas couldn't get into the child's room, and turned the stove on and just suffered from carbon dioxide poisoning. After her death, this is when the majority of her collections came out. So her most well-known book, Ariel, was published 2 years after her death, and this was the most dark and talked about book per se. It was just a collection of poetry and such. Then after that, Crossing the Water and the book Winter Trees also came out in 1971. And then finally in 1981, her ex-husband Ted had edited and composed it's called the Collecting Poems, and this is just the poems that Sylvia had written shortly before death. And then, so that's just kind of basically her life. And so, as a writer, she writes about many kind of sorts of things in her own life, her personal experiences. So she wrote a majority of poems to start. She had written novels, but the novels were basically collections of her poems together. Her first poem was published when she was 8 years old, and then after that, her publishings came out in the Christie Science Mentor. Her first book was The Colossus, and this was one of two of the only books that were actually published when she was alive. Her most famous book is Ariel, because it had such dark, twisted views on the everyday life. But her most impactful book was the collected poems book, because this won the Pulitzer's Prize, and she was the first poet to ever win the Pulitzer's Prize. It usually only goes with prose writing people. And this is very important. She wrote about feminism and wrote about her relatable circumstances in her life. She wrote about her father's death. She wrote about how she was a bad parent toward her daughter, and then she also wrote about how the loss of her marriage and Ted, and that's why she's so dark and cynical, because she has all these emotions built up, and she wrote them just down on the paper darkly because she had kind of more of an unfortunate kind of life. And then so some of the like motifs and things that exist within her poem, they're always more dark and kind of cynical. She was a very very vivid writer, per se. So she took an average thing like cutting your finger on accident when you're cutting an onion, and turned it into a very vivid and dark and morbid pleasure, and this is what appealed to most people. This is kind of also what kind of criticized her, because she talked about terms of feminism and things like that, and this kind of criticized her, but this has also put her on the map, because she was the only one talking about feminism at the time, and she was also the only one putting these dark, very, very dark, and kind of almost disturbing images on these pieces of paper, and allowing people to look at that. So she was criticized at the time, and she was also popular when her writings came out. However, she would have been even more popular if she was still alive and her writings came out.
Okay, and then I'm just going to go a little more in depth about why Sylvia Plath was so famous during her time, and why she's still pretty relevant to this day, and what we can kind of take from her work. So, like Bryce said, she committed suicide just 2 weeks after she wrote probably one of her most famous books, The Bell Jar, and also her other most famous work, Ariel, was published after she died. And this was really good timing, actually. It sounds bad, but it was really good timing, because during this time, the second wave feminist movement was occurring. 2 years prior, Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, which kind of led this feminist movement during the 60s and 70s. And the world kind of needed a woman writer, which is what Sylvia Plath gave to us. Since she did commit suicide, she became a sort of martyr for this cause, and set a precedent for other women writers during her time. Even though her work isn't limited to feminist ideals, she does write with a very angry, funny, honest voice about other issues. And that's what's so important about her work, that she's a woman writing about these things. She writes about depression, stress, broken families. Like Bryce said, her dad did die, which influenced a lot of her work. And Sylvia, she was really open about the pain and powerlessness that she was feeling in her life with these issues. Going through school, that's definitely something we can relate to as college students, feeling that kind of hopelessness in life, especially if you're experiencing depression like she was. But yeah, these are still, the problems that she talks about are really still relevant to us today. And her work can reach today's reader, especially since her writing is so accessible. She writes pretty simply. There are some really great literary elements, and Plath was a professional poet and writer. She went to school. She's professionally trained. She is a master writer. So her work isn't by accident. There are definite literary techniques, really skilled literary techniques that are coming out in her work. It's not just by accident, but it is still accessible. The dialogue is pretty simple. There's a lot of dialogue in The Bell Jar specifically, so it is very accessible for readers today. And it's definitely a book that everybody should read, The Bell Jar, I think. Her poetry is really great as well. But The Bell Jar, it's really something special. And she does catch a lot of flack because she is a privileged white woman writing about these issues. She went to Cambridge, she went to all these really nice universities. So what does she have to be depressed about? Some people would say. Well, I think that brings up a great point about the nature of depression in general, which is something that her work definitely highlights. She said you could have the world splitting open at your feet like a ripe watermelon, which is a quote that she said in a letter to her mom one time, and still be depressed. And you can't necessarily help that. You could have the entire world ahead of you. You could be the most intelligent young woman in the entire world, but still be depressed. And that's just the nature of mental illness, which is an important idea that she represents in her work, which kind of walks a thin line between an angsty teen novel and a serious work of literature. And I think the exploration of human survival, her challenging of social norms, she's not a traditional woman in her work. Her focus is on survival, not on being a traditional woman. And also her work explores sort of nihilistic and metaphysical things. And I think those are the things that push her work over that line into the more literary realm. She writes with a really mature cadence, and she has a lot of important ideas. She's not just a confessional poet, she really explores important issues and literary themes. And she approaches really serious issues with a sense of humor, which is really unique, especially coming from such an underrepresented demographic like young women. And she's just a very unique writer and offers something that not a lot of other writers in this literary world possess. And I think that's why she's a significant figure in English studies, and we should be studying her.